afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for joining us. Today's virtual learning webinar is about grief and loss, and we're really excited to have you here. My name is Kayla White, and I'm a community education specialist at MDA. We're thrilled to have you join us today for this webinar. This learning series is part of our larger MDA community education programs, which focus on bringing the neuromuscular disease community together around education and resources. Be sure to visit the community education section on mda.org for updates on upcoming events. We are recording today's event and we'll be posting it to the website for on-demand viewing at a later date. And please know that all phone lines have been muted. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the webinar, and you can use the chat feature to send in your questions. Feel free to send questions in as you think of them, and they'll be addressed at the end of the session. I would also like to thank our webinar supporter, Edgewise Therapeutics. We would not be able to provide community education webinars like this if not for their generous support, and we are very thankful and appreciative. For over 70 years, MDA has led the way in accelerating research, advancing care, and advocating for the support of our families. MDA's mission is to empower people living with muscular dystrophy, ALS, and related neuromuscular diseases to live longer, more independent lives. Our mission comes to life through these 4 pillars. First, care. Through our national network of MDA care centers across the U.S., we support individuals and families from day one of their journey. Second, champion. Through our advocacy and education efforts, we empower families with information and resources. Third, catalyst. Through our investments in research, we are furthering advancements in treatment discoveries. And fourth, community. Through programs like Summer Camp, our Connections program, and our community events, we are helping individuals and families build supportive connections and relationships. If you haven't done so already, we invite you to join the MDA community by registering with us. I would now like to introduce today's guest, David Stevenson, a Bereavement Coordinator and Counselor at Crossroads Hospice and Palliative Care, based out of Philadelphia. David earned his master's degree from Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia and his bachelor's degree from Grove City College. He has a diverse career background that includes serving as a chaplain in the U.S. Army. Prior to his current role with Crossroads, he worked as a child grief specialist at Highmark Caring Place, recognized as a premier grieving center for children, adolescents, and their families. David also has a strong background in autism, having worked with children and adults with autism for many years. David's unique background supporting individuals with a wide variety of needs and his commitment to help all people to lead their most fulfilling lives combined to create a unique ability to serve those who are experiencing grief and loss. In addition to his work at Crossroads, he volunteers with Peter's Place, a grieving center for children in the Philadelphia area. Thank you for being here, David. The floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you. Good afternoon, friends. I want to start off by thanking the MDA for drawing focus and attention on your grief, something you no doubt face on a daily basis. I also want to share right from the get-go that this particular area of grief and loss is not something I have a lot of experience with. In fact, really no direct experience until recently, and I will share about that in a little bit. Don't get me wrong, most of my career has been in the area of grief and loss, specifically the grief and loss associated with a death that has occurred. My current work is with Crossroads Hospice and Palliative Care, and here our bereavement team follows up with family members for up to 13 months after the death of their person. I share this because I get the opportunity to talk a lot about grief and loss, but it is almost always related to the death of someone. It is completely different grief and loss from what you folks and your caregivers experience related to a neuromuscular disease. Sure, there are similarities, and we will discuss them, but there are huge, and I mean huge, differences. But let's first talk about some of the basics of grief. Grief is a natural response to loss. Each of us experiences many losses throughout our lifetime. What these losses look like and the resulting grief and sadness and other emotions are unique to each person's circumstances. And each person grieves differently. Each individual's grief, even if the circumstances to that loss are somewhat the same, is unique because we are all unique. We all have unique personalities, styles, temperaments, and unique relationships with who or what we lose throughout our lifetime. And all of this impacts how we cope and how we deal with our grief. Generally, grief is most often associated with a finite loss, one associated with death and dying. But grief is complex and can manifest from losses that may not be as obvious or even recognized, leaving people confused about the source of their deep emotions. The grief and loss associated with having a neuromuscular disease is a living or non-finite loss. Living losses are defined as experiences that are enduring in nature, usually precipitated by a negative life event or episode that retains a physical or psychological presence in an ongoing manner. In other words, it's a loss that keeps on giving and never really goes away. No doubt some of you can relate to this. Some examples of living losses include the loss of functionality due to a disability or a disease, the loss of hopes and dreams, or the loss of vision of how we thought life would be. Another example is the feeling of loss of someone who is alive but unavailable physically or emotionally. For those of you who are watching this webinar, you may be experiencing the characteristics of living losses. One of those characteristics may include an ongoing fear and uncertainty about the future. Those of you with a neuromuscular disease experience losses that are ongoing, that continue forward in time, with discovery of even more newer losses. Secondly, you may also experience a sense of separation or disconnection from what is considered mainstream, a sense of not being normal or typical. This creates a distance between yourself and others. Third, having a living loss, because this type of loss is less understood than a finite loss, like a death, others don't acknowledge or recognize the gravity or depth of your losses and the nature of those losses. Fourth, with a living loss, you may experience an ongoing sense of helplessness or powerlessness associated with the loss or losses. And fifth, due to the uncertainty of the future, conflicting thoughts and emotions may occur, such as dread, then relief, hope, then hopelessness, anger, then empathy, motivation to take action, and then sheer exhaustion. As I provide support to those who are in the throes of grief, I often say that the worst grief is grief that is not addressed. Too often, when someone experiences a death in their family, they get lost in busyness or do not see the benefit of pressing toward the pain of their loss, toward healing. So their grief remains unaddressed. So what happens? The impact of their unaddressed grief shows itself in a host of ways. At the very least, a continued struggle with sleep, or much worse, addictions or physical or medical issues. In my humble opinion, you who are experiencing living losses that often go unrecognized or unacknowledged, are at a danger for unaddressed grief even more. We only have to turn on the country music radio station and we almost immediately hear a song that touches on the grief experienced by a death. But when was the last time you turned the radio on and heard a song about the grief folks experience with a neuromuscular disease or some other medical condition? Probably never. So what may be the impact when your grief is not addressed? One result might be chronic sadness or other strong emotions. Let's take the feeling of sadness. What does chronic sadness mean? Chronic sadness would be persisting for a long time or constantly reoccurring. Whether it be chronic sadness, chronic anger, or chronic fear, any of these strong emotions persisting for a long time or constantly reoccurring would result in an incredible amount of wear and tear on the soul. This could be the impact of unaddressed grief or grief that's not being managed well. Another thing we may see when grief is not addressed or being managed well would be the avoidance of others and loss of connection. You may very often feel like nobody really understands what your loss is and your grief looks like. Perhaps no matter how much time you try to explain this to others, they just don't or can't get it. So what might you end up doing? Isolating yourself. I often get calls from folks who are grieving and they are wondering if they're doing okay in their grief and if they're managing their grief well. And one of the first things I ask them is, are they isolating themselves? If you find yourself isolating, you should ask yourself, is my grief not being managed well? Preparing for this webinar was a rather daunting task for me. I felt inept at addressing a crowd of people whom I have no way of relating to what you're going through as you journey along with a neuromuscular disease, let alone all the grief and loss associated with having the disease, or the grief and loss associated with having a loved one with a neuromuscular disease. When I support someone who's experienced a death, I can easily connect with that because I know their type of grief in some way as I've experienced death losses. As I try to imagine what you folks grieve over, my heart aches, as I'm sure those losses are many, too many to fully spell out. I would think that some of you who are watching this webinar find yourself trying to manage your grief all the time. Maybe you find yourself saying, there's no way I'll be able to do this task. Of course, that is what I would like to do, but I'm just not able to do it. Yes, I'm disappointed. I can't achieve that dream of mine, but what can I do? How I imagined or hoped my life would be is nothing like it is in reality. And I could go on and on. Recently, I had an elderly lady in one of my grief support groups. We'll call her Rita. Rita was attending the group as she recently experienced a death in her family, her husband. And for 6 weeks, Rita would roll herself by wheelchair into the group, fully participating in the conversations. At one point in the group meeting, I handed out sheets of paper and pens to all the participants and gave them a writing exercise called A Message to Your Loved One. As folks started writing their messages, I looked around the room and noticed that Rita wasn't writing. It then dawned on me, she wasn't able to pick up the pen and write. I went over and sat next to her, and she quietly shared with me that she was diagnosed with muscular dystrophy in her early 20s. She went on to share with me that when she was first diagnosed, she was newly married and physically able to do everything for herself and go anywhere she wanted. I said to her, "Wow, I know you are here because you lost your husband, but gosh, the losses you have had to endure throughout your lifetime." She went on to share with me how, as her disease progressed, it has become very difficult to adjust, as she could no longer do tasks that she was so used to doing independently, or going to places she was so used to going and places that she loved to go. But Rita then expressed gratefulness for her family's support and her independent spirit that pushed her to find accommodations and adjustments as she could have the best quality life as possible. Clearly, part of why Rita's quality of life is so good is that she expresses her grief well. But she doesn't sit in her grief all day. She gets the support she needs, which helps her to be grateful as well. So let's pause. So I've talked about the nature of grief in general, and then how you folks may be experiencing the effects of your grief and losses. If I stopped here, there's a big problem, right? I want to turn the corner now and get practical regarding hope and coping. What strategies can you use to cope with your grief and losses? How do you find hope and healing in your losses? This is why many of you tuned into the webinar, right? And it would be interesting to hear when we get to our question time, what things have helped you in your grief? What things give you hope? One strategy might be that you acknowledge the losses and all the feelings associated with these losses. Often, living losses are not fully recognized by others. It's important to remind yourself that these are real and valid losses, even if they're not death-related losses. If you find yourself comparing losses, immediately shutting down your emotions by saying, "It could be worse, I should just be grateful," give yourself space for feeling. Yes, it could be worse. And yes, you are also still experiencing something that brings strong emotions that you are allowed to acknowledge and feel. Please don't forget that there are other feelings you are experiencing besides sadness. Acknowledge those feelings and acknowledge those feelings with others for support and validation. Whether it be anger, confusion, regret, loneliness, don't allow a feeling to sit and stir within with no way out. Sometimes the way out are tears, sometimes screaming, sometimes a physical activity, sometimes listening to a song or looking at art, sometimes sharing those feelings with others. I would imagine that it's easy to be frightened of your feelings when you're facing a life-debilitating health condition. You may think that bottling up your emotions, putting on a brave face, or forcing yourself to be positive and cheerful will lead to the best outcome. And that's simply not true. Being honest and vulnerable about any negative emotions you're experiencing won't negatively impact your health or condition in any way. It may even have the opposite effect. I read about a study into the coping styles of patients with cancer. The study concluded that being cheerful has little effect on the success of treatment or rate of reoccurrence. In fact, bottling up your emotions may only increase your stress levels, elevate the amount of pain you feel, and make you more susceptible to anxiety and depression. It's often the act of refusing to face your fears that leads you to hopelessness, sadness, and pain that can come with battling an illness or a disease. Acknowledge your feelings with others who understand what you are facing. You will feel validated and less alone. A support group can be a safe place to talk about what you're going through and get coping tips from others who are undergoing similar losses. If you don't click with the first group you try another group. It can sometimes take several attempts to find the group that is right for you. Facing a life-debilitating disease can leave you feeling alone and cut off from even those closest to you. You may feel that others can't understand what you're going through, or perhaps those around you are trying to be so positive that you don't feel able to open up and express how you really feel. Or perhaps you're worried about being a burden to other people if you talk honestly about what you're experiencing or feeling. Whatever your situation, now is not the time to retreat into your shell. Social support can have a huge impact on your mental health when you're facing the stress of a serious medical condition. As well as providing practical tips for living, having people to lean on is essential to your emotional well-being. Staying connected to others and continuing to enjoy social activities can make a world of difference in your mood and your outlook. Choose the support that's right for you. This is a very personal decision, but trying to tough it out alone will only deny those who care about you the chance to offer support. Don't let worries about being a burden keep you from reaching out to others. The people who care about you will be grateful for your trust and won't judge you as weak or being a burden. Reaching out to them will only strengthen the bond between you. Look for support from friends and loved ones who are good listeners. When you choose to confide in someone, try to find someone who's a good listener, someone who has big ears. I sort of have big ears. Someone who will listen attentively and compassionately without being distracted or judging you or trying to tell you how they think you should feel or think. I often say to those who are grieving that looking for people to support them, that they don't need someone who knows exactly what to say. They need someone who has big ears and can listen. That's why God gave you twice as many organs for listening than he did for speaking. Being a good listener and trying to understand someone's grief is much more powerful than trying to say the right words. Make FaceTime a priority. While it's always good to have support from friends and loved ones by phone, text, video, or social media, it's important to find in-person support as well. Connecting face-to-face with someone who cares about you can play a huge role in managing your grief, relieving stress, and boosting your mood. Post-pandemic, face-to-face connections can still be a challenge to find. I can only encourage you to keep trying, and let's all hope we can continue to see a rise in these connections and these meetups. Besides acknowledging your feelings and having a strong support system, another strategy you might find helpful in managing your grief is to practice dialectical thinking. As humans, we can be very black and white thinkers. We categorize things as good or bad, right or wrong, when often things exist in shades of gray. Two things that feel contradictory to one another can both be true. It can be helpful to practice holding two truths at the same time, being open to the idea that there are many lives worth living. Even though you may not be living the life you always imagined and hoped for, that doesn't mean it can't have joy and meaning. Sadness over loss and joy over your life can exist in the same place. Another strategy that will help you cope with your grief and your stress is to control the flow of information. One lesson I learned during the pandemic is that information doesn't always mean power. Were you like me, always tuned into the news and to Google in your effort to understand COVID and the way out? I imagine it's much worse when you are told that you have a neuromuscular disease or your family has a neuromuscular disease. When you hear of a diagnosis, what is our first reaction? If you answered, take to Google and read everything you can on the diagnosis, you're perfectly normal. In the face of fear and uncertainty, we desperately seek information. Unfortunately, this quest for answers is not only overwhelming to your system in every way, but it often presents you repeatedly with information and stories that violate your concept of yourself and your loved one and your imagined futures for both of you. Though this can feel impossibly difficult, try to take in information in small doses with time and support, and only go to trusted reading sources, those your medical team endorse. Pause. Reconstructing your identity can be another strategy in managing your grief. With any living loss, your self-concept is deeply impacted. Who you understand yourself to be in the world or imagined you would be in the world can feel like it no longer aligns with who you are. So spend time connecting with the core pieces of yourself that remain strong and intact. Acknowledge the roles and identities you have lost and those you have taken on. Consider who you were, who you are, and who you hope to be. Another strategy you can use to manage your grief is to consider the idea of adaptation rather than acceptance. I will never accept this is a common phrase I hear from grievers. I get it as it relates to a death. Acceptance is a complicated word. The idea that one needs to feel acceptance sounds like we're being asked to wave the white flag of surrender and accept this new dreaded reality. Rather than focusing on acceptance, it can be helpful to focus on adaptation or acclimation. A question to think about is, can we continue to find the loss unacceptable while still trying to actively adapt to our new reality with an openness to hope? I feel that Rita, the spunky lady from my grief support group, I feel she demonstrated this. We were talking about coping strategies for our grief, and she shared that one of hers is when she's feeling low, she wills herself to the window and marvels at the beauty of creation. She loved to sit by the window and watch the birds and just get lost in their beauty. It brought her comfort and peace and hope. Another strategy to share is to redefine hope. Like reconstructing identity, redefining hope is a critical component of many non-death losses. Though our inclination can be to fixate on changing the circumstances of the loss and maintaining hope that things will get back to normal, sometimes this is impossible. It simply reinforces a sense of helplessness. By facing the present moment, you can ask yourself what hope looks like in this new reality. You may need to find many new ways of understanding and measuring hope based on the current reality. How you define hope will continue to change as you and your life continues to change. And ought we talk about pursuing activities that bring you meaning and joy? You are not defined by your medical condition. Having a neuromuscular disease doesn't have to define you as a person. By continuing to pursue other activities, ones that bring meaning and purpose and joy to your life, you can reaffirm that it's these things that define you as an individual. We're all different, so we all have different ways of experiencing meaning and joy. If the progression of your disease means that it's no longer possible for you to pursue some of the activities you previously enjoyed, you could still find other activities that nourish and enrich your spirit. Pick up a long neglected hobby or try a new hobby. Taking a class or joining a club can help you pursue a hobby and also expand your social network. Learn something new, like a foreign language or a new game. Get involved in your community. Try attending a local event or volunteering for a cause that's important to you. Like Rita, spend time in nature or looking at nature. Enjoy the arts. Visit a museum. Go to a concert or a play, or join a book group. Write your memoirs, or a how-to book, or a blog about your experiences. And that could also be very helpful for you expressing your grief. A final tip or strategy I believe is extremely important to consider is to deal with anxiety and depression. When you have a serious health condition, it's normal to feel sad about your health and grieve the hopes and dreams that you may have lost as a result of your condition. It's also natural to worry about what the future may hold or be apprehensive about certain treatments, for example. But if such feelings persist and start to interfere with your daily life, you may be suffering from depression or anxiety. While mood disorders like anxiety and depression are common among folks dealing with a serious health condition, they can create a vicious circle. Your illness triggers anxiety or depression, which then erodes your overall health, which in turn negatively impacts the treatment of your illness. This then worsens your mood disorder and so on, a vicious circle. So as well as counseling and medication, the following can help you cope with anxiety and depression. Manage debilitating symptoms such as pain. Left untreated, pain can have a detrimental effect on your mood and increase anxious thoughts and feelings of hopelessness. Talk to your medical team about ways to better manage pain and other distressing symptoms. 2, ease up on the worrying. We all worry, especially when we're sick. But if you're constantly overestimating the possibility that things will turn out badly or immediately jumping to the worst case scenario, it's time to take action. There are steps you can take to challenge your anxious thoughts, distinguish between solvable and unsolvable worries, and develop a more balanced way at looking at your situation. And 3, take care of yourself. Confiding in others, exercising, and eating, sleeping well are all proven ways to help improve depression and anxiety symptoms. Cut down on sugar in your diet. By reducing the amount of soft drinks, sweets, and sugary snacks in your diet, you'll feel less anxious and avoid the mood crashes that usually follow a sugar high. Be smart about caffeine, alcohol, and nicotine. Reducing or cutting out caffeine intake can help with anxiety. Similarly, alcohol can worsen both anxiety and depressive symptoms. And while it may seem like cigarettes are calming, nicotine is actually a powerful stimulant that leads to higher, not lower, levels of anxiety and stress. So there you have it. What strategies did we cover that may help in managing your grief? We talked about acknowledging your losses and all the feelings. We talked about choosing a good support system. Practice dialectical thinking. Control the flow of information. Construct your identity and redefine hope. Consider the idea of adaptation rather than acceptance. Pursue activities that bring you meaning and joy. Deal with anxiety and depression. And though we touched on this throughout our conversation, the coping strategies for those of you who are supporting someone with a neuromuscular disease are essentially the same. You too need to acknowledge the feelings you wrestle with as you not only deal with your own losses, but also the losses of your loved one you are supporting and caring for. You too need a strong support system. You too need to put into place all of these strategies. You need to exercise strong self-care and have activities in place that give you joy and meaning and energy. Caregiver burnout is real. I've witnessed this firsthand. Just as we are instructed by flight attendants on our flights, you must put the oxygen mask on yourself first so that you are strong to be able to help put the oxygen mask on those you love. So that ends my words, but I'm hoping that some of you might have some things to share or maybe some questions that would benefit the others who are on this webinar.
Thank you so much, David, for that information. Very helpful and beneficial. We've had some comments come in. I don't see any questions yet, but I know that someone talked about, at time of diagnosis, feeling lots of tears, shock and denial, and confusion.
Oh, wow, those feelings, those strong emotions. And we talked about how common they are for you folks to be feeling those emotions, and it's good to feel them, but it's also good to express them, to express them in the company of people are going to validate what you are experiencing. And like I said, have the big ears to really listen to what you have to share rather than perhaps shutting you down.
Let's see. Oh, I think am I frozen? Okay, there we go. Sorry, because some computer issues. So a few people have mentioned some things that they have done, some of their own coping strategies. Someone mentioned they've started back to college to pursue a career that's remote. Somebody mentioned that she honors her daughter by eating her favorite food on the 9th of every month.
Oh, wow. Someone whose daughter has died, is that?
I believe so. And she said she also created a garden in her front yard to honor her daughter.
Oh, wow. That's beautiful.
That's a beautiful idea. Let's see. Somebody asked if a copy of this can be obtained. We will be sending out a link to the recording. And let's see. Do you have any suggestions for how to reconstruct your identity? How to kind of help build that back up?
Well, I think the one viewer who mentioned that she's taking some courses toward a degree, that's a good example of someone who's in the process of kind of reconstructing their identity. They're tapping into some things that they have strength. And, you know, I feel real humbled being in the presence of you folks who are listening to this webinar, because I know many of you have some real strong physical ailments and disadvantages there. But I know within there's the spirit. And that's, I think, what a lot of us, when we reconstruct our identity, we're really tapping into the inside, you know, the spirit within, to do and be what we hope to do and be in order to make a difference in the world, to help others, whatever that mission that we are taking on will be.
We got some questions coming in now, so I'm trying to keep up with them. Do you have any books that you would recommend that are good for somebody to read on any of these subjects?
Well, it's a book, but I have an excellent book this is a book that it's called What's Your Grief? And it's based on a website that is an absolute favorite website of mine called What's Your Grief, www.whatsyourgrief.com. And what they did is they took a lot of their information on grief and loss and they put it in a book form. And it's a really, really good book that gives you a lot of lists, but also some activities that I would think would be easy to kind of transfer to not dealing with just your grief as far as a loss goes, death loss, but also a living loss. So I think you'd be able to kind of adapt some of these activities and list to what's going to touch you and be beneficial to you in your particular losses.
Okay, great. Thank you. Somebody says adaptation is a new thought to me. Any ideas on how to start?
Well, I think, to me, when I think of adaptation, I immediately, my mind goes to the medical professionals and the people who are involved in your medical care, because I would think that, that there are so many, perhaps some therapies and tools out there that people can utilize to be able to accomplish tasks that they can maybe no longer do on their own, but with some kind of adaptation, they may be able to do those things. I feel like it's not really in my wheelhouse, but I know just by some of the things I've seen online, and that there are some amazing tools and devices out there that really help people accomplish some of the things that they'd like to do that they no longer can do. And I can also remember in talking with the lady that I mentioned that was in my group, Rita, she mentioned really having a team of loved ones who love to come over and help her do things that she can no longer do on her own. And so she not only gets the help to be able to accomplish some tasks, but she also gets the connection with family support. And these particular family members get a lot of joy and reinforcement and encouragement just by helping her out.
Okay. Somebody has asked She says, my husband and I have had the goal to take our granddaughters to Disney World. He wants to wait until they are around 10. They are 1 and 5 now. He refuses to listen to me about my condition and my worry of waiting that long. How can I get him to understand that I can't wait that long?
Oh, wow. That is tough. I would think that, maybe your husband is, being that he's not interacted with a lot of caregivers or maybe folks with a neuromuscular disease, that he hasn't really heard a lot of the stories and how the disease progresses. Maybe there's some education that he needs in order to get a good handle on what may or may not happen as far as how things progress. And, I think by you giving him an opportunity to really try to understand where you're coming from can be really helpful. I know communication in any relationship is key for it to be a healthy dialogue. And when we think of communication, our mind should automatically go to understanding one another rather than what we say. So I've encouraged a lot of couples and even in my own relationships, how when we have something heavy to say, sometimes it's good to even just kind of prelude what we want to say by just saying, hey, I want to share something with you. And rather than trying to come back to me with an answer right away, I'd really like to hear from you that you really understand what I'm trying to communicate. And just maybe kind of framing that way in hopes that your husband would be able to parrot back what he hears you saying as far as the fear of how Disney World might look years from now compared to what it would look like today.
That's a great idea, reframing that. Thank you so much. Next question. Someone has said, as a psychotherapist working with individuals with neuromuscular diseases, I work on helping these individuals accept the idea that they haven't accepted their diagnosis 100%. We work on adapting their life and career according to their abilities. However, is it healthy to give themselves a small window each day, 10 to 15 minutes, to feel bad for themselves and their condition and cry it out?
Wow, that's interesting. That reminds me of what I often try to encourage folks in my line of work, is my profession, is to intentionally grieve. Because sometimes we get so busy with life and activities that we don't really focus on what we've lost and those strong feelings that are associated with that loss. And so sometimes we do encourage people, whether it be at the beginning of their day, I think it's good to kind of maybe get it out of the way if you can, to have some intentional time for grieving. And sometimes that looks like listening to music, that maybe brings up emotion, or reading something that brings up emotion, just having I think that's an excellent suggestion to see how that might benefit someone in their treatment and in their journey.
Somebody has asked, do you recommend following the stages of grief each time a new symptom occurs?
Well, I wondered if the stages of grief would come up in a question, and this is a struggle for me. I'm not going to lie. And I know Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. I'm very familiar with her writing. I do, and I do think that those stages are valuable to try to understand. But I also know that she was very much a proponent that these stages are fluid and you can perhaps bounce around. And so when I share about grief, and I don't know if this is going to help you folks particularly, but I think it will. When I share about grief and loss, I like to talk about the grief. I call it a grief spiral. And so I'll bring like this big slinky as an illustration that rather than grief being a progression of stages, grief is more like a spiral. We are triggered in our grief and we climb up the spiral, and then we enact a coping strategy and we kind of come down the spiral. Another way to look at the big slinky as far as grief and loss and the grief spiral is that sometimes our grief is very accentuated, and it's really like in our face. Like I have this slinky in front of me. I can't see around it at all. I can only see my grief. And then as I open up and as I talk to others and start to share my grief with others, I can then see through my grief and be able to manage it better. So rather than use the stage theory in grief and loss, I like to use the grief spiral. And if anyone's interested in reading more about that, they can just hop on the website for Dr. Alan Wolfelt. He's the one that's kind of developed this grief spiral idea.
That's a great visual. Thank you for sharing that. That's very ingenious.
Yeah, it's impactful for me. I mean, really, and I think I would think that people who are wrestling with a neuromuscular disease and caregivers could relate to that somehow too, and how grief bounces around and goes up and down on the spiral rather than being stuck on different stages at one time. Even if they're fluid, it's like you have to identify a stage and then move to another stage. And where with the spiral, it's just kind of going up and down like that.
Absolutely. The next question is one that I'm very interested in as well. I think we all can agree that COVID has kind of changed the way that we live and do a lot of things. So someone has asked, socializing is difficult for me. Being high risk because of medication makes me concerned about being out and about. How can we integrate and get over that anxiety, especially now that fewer people are taking precautions?
Oh, wow. I mean, I don't think anyone should, you should not do something that makes you feel uncomfortable. I think that's, your own personal boundaries are important. If there'd be no way that I would be in a room with you and I would shame you into going into a crowd because I think you should be in that crowd. I think you need to feel comfortable. I know that people with COVID precautions, it runs a spectrum. And, I still feel that we're early on in the kind of coming out phase of the pandemic. I don't think, it hasn't been all that time since we were at the height of the pandemic. And so I have a lot of hope that over time, and as we learn more about the virus itself, that we will open up more. But in the meantime, social interaction is so important for you. If you feel that you need to stay inside and not be around people, then I would strongly encourage you. One of the silver linings of this pandemic has been the Zoom support groups, the ones that are by video. Though we would all agree, I think, that being in person is better. It's nice to be face to face with people. This is an alternative, and it's a good alternative. It's not like it's a negative thing. It's still a way of connecting with people and getting support and offering tips and even just really getting to know people and having a relationship with the folks who are in your group. So I would encourage you to take advantage of the many groups that are out there by Zoom.
Yep, it seems like everything is on Zoom now.
Yeah, but I hear what she's saying, but I will say,
Definitely.
even with grief and loss, death losses and support groups, in-person groups are still extremely hard to find. I mean, they're happening, and probably over the last 6 months, more and more are starting to happen. So I think we're on this trajectory of coming out more. And so the hope is that the person who asked the question, that eventually, with science and understanding the virus more, that he or she will be able to be with people more, where she can get that social interaction and that support.
Absolutely. Somebody has asked, how do you find support in a social setting without being the negative person? How do you not put on the happy face for the benefit of others?
Well, I guess it depends on the group that you're going to, but whoever wrote this question, I hope that that might be a barrier that you're going to need to kind of push through. You know, if you're coming to one of my groups, for instance, and I would hope that anybody else who would be facilitating this type of support group, that it would be, it's one of our group roles that when people share what they're sharing on their heart and their feelings, that there's no judgment, there's no criticism, that people, what they share as far as their feelings, being vulnerable, that's important. And a support group it's important to share those heavy emotions. I think it's important when we think about a grief group or a grief support group that, yes, it's okay to cry and it's okay to express those feelings, but you'll notice when you're in a support group that it's also okay to laugh. And when we grieve, we need to express those heavy emotions, but we also need to take a break from them. And I always say that children give us a good picture of how to grieve in a healthy way. Because I've seen kids, I used to work with children in grief, where they'll be sad for one moment, and the next moment they're laughing and playing a game, and parents will be like, what's wrong with my daughter? How come she's not always sad? Well, we need to take a break from that sadness too. And we need to take a break and focus on something else, and then get back to the sadness. And a support group is a place for you to share those feelings. And I hope that you can get that somewhere.
All right, so we are coming up on the end of our time. So I've got just one last question. A few people have asked if you have any ideas on how to find the best therapy or the best treatment, the best resources for them.
Well, I'm not too familiar with the MDA website, but I would think that there are some resource lists of people who are well versed in neuromuscular disease that would be able to support people who are wrestling with the feelings that are associated with their health. And you know, I know for me, I'm part of a network of individuals who provide grief support, and again, mostly to people who've experienced a death in their family. And it's important to be selective about who you go to. I will say, you would think that most therapists understand what grief means, but that's not always the case. And so just as you would use like the shopping mindset to look for a realtor to sell your house, you need to use that shopping mindset when you look for a therapist. And, you know, it's okay to have like an introductory session just to get to know them and where they're coming from and what their viewpoint is on your disease and also on the losses that you're struggling with.
And yes, Marissa has put some links into the chat for the MDA Resource Center, so you can click on that to visit the Resource Center. So again, we are coming up on the end of the time. I don't think we got to all of the questions, but David, we so thank you for your time, your expertise, and everything you do for the community. This has been very informational and just so helpful, and we really do appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much for I feel so honored to be able to be sitting with you folks, and I'm going to be thinking good thoughts your way, and keep expressing and addressing your grief.
Thank you. So if you are new to MDA and are diagnosed with a neuromuscular disease under MDA's umbrella, or are a loved one of someone who is diagnosed, we encourage you to stay engaged with MDA. You can do this by visiting mda.org/join and completing a short form. Joining is free and will keep you up to date on the latest research, educational programs, and supports. We would love to hear your comments about this webinar. If you have a smartphone, you can open up your camera and point it at the QR code on the screen. A web page will pop up with a short survey on the webinar. If you don't have a smartphone, no worries. Once the webinar is over, a screen will pop up with a survey as well, and you'll get it in an email. If anyone has questions after this webinar, please feel free to email them to mdaengage@mdausa.org, and we will follow up with you. This concludes today's webinar. David, thank you so much again. We so appreciate your time. Thank you everybody for attending, and we hope you all have a great day.